You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Andrea Warren.
Well, thanks for tuning in to Author Stories today. We've got a fantastic show for you. Go to hankgarner.com and subscribe to the show. Any way that you download podcasts, you can listen to it there. I'd like to talk about some sponsors before we get started. Scribophile is a respectful online writing workshop and writers community. Writers of all skill levels join to improve each other's work with thoughtful critiques and by sharing their writing experience. We're the writing group to join if you want to find beta readers, get the best feedback around, learn how to get published, and be part of the friendliest and most successful writing workshop online. Improve your writing by receiving detailed critiques, learn from a vast collection of free writing resources, make lifelong friends in our busy community of writers. Writing is a solitary art, but that doesn't mean you have to be lonely. Lucky for you, there are thousands of writers on Scribophile every day, and we're a really friendly bunch. You've never seen a writing group like this one. Join Scribophile today at scribophile.com. For the Words is a unique writing motivator unlike anything I've ever seen. For the Words is an online writing platform which motivates writers of all backgrounds to increase their word count through gamification. Writing can be challenging, especially when you need to consistently produce a high output of words. By injecting a little fun into that routine and using daily rewards to promote a healthy writing habit, For the Words makes it easier to reach those word count goals. We're a community of bloggers, professional authors, college and high school students, research scientists, gamers, and first-time writers from all over the world. Come for the words, stay for the fun. It's forthewords.com. That's the number 4, thewords.com. Business Essentials for Writers, How to Make Money in an Ever-Changing Industry by James Nettles. Business Essentials for Authors is your business 101 guide for the publishing industry. Whether you have never published at all or are looking to take your professional career up a notch in an easy-to-read and conversational way, the book covers the 5 pillars of business. Meet all of the people and jobs in the publishing industry and how they fit together, building the foundation of your business career, including paths to publication, understanding sales and marketing in publishing, establishing all of the operational side of any business, from contracts and intellectual property, working with different tools and technologists, and how to design and build your website, learning how money works as an author, basic accounting, and making more money. We look at all this and more from a long-term strategic view, how to get the plan done, and the mindset to make it all work together. It's Business Essentials for Writers by James Nettles. Kick. The Jenkins Cycle, Book 1 by John L. Monk. A supernatural thriller. They say suicides are damned for eternity, but if possessing the bodies of violent criminals is hell, then Dan Jenkins will take it, and he does every time a portal arrives to whisk him from his ghostly exile. Normally, before the villain returns to kick him out, Dan dishes out a final serving of justice and leaves the world a safer place. It's one of the rules if he wants more rides, and he's happy to oblige. For a part-time dead guy, it's a pretty good gig. And then he meets her. Kick is the first book in a series of supernatural thrillers. If you like Quantum Leap and Everyday, you'll love this gritty and original take on the body-hopping hero story. Vividly written, Kick is a wild ride with a sharp, sarcastic wit and a flawed yet likable main character. Kick by John L. Monk. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Andrea Warren on the show with me today. She has a fantastic new book called Enemy Child, The Story of Norman Mineta, a boy imprisoned in a Japanese-American internment camp during World War II. This is a fascinating book, and I know you have a fascinating story as well, Andrea. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you. Before we get started, though, we begin each show with the same question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I don't have a first memory. I have a much more generalized. I was the one who was always sitting there with a notepad and a pen, scribbling stories, or I was spinning them in my head, or I was telling them to someone else. I just don't know where it originated. I will say that my parents always read to me and to my siblings when we were young. Books and stories were just part of our life, and very possibly I was strongly influenced by that.
That's excellent. Were you a big reader as a child?
Oh, yes. I lived in a very small town, but we had a lovely little library, and it was so traditional. It was one of those where you couldn't speak above a whisper, and you could not check out a book if you could not reach it. So adult books were higher up, and that's the way, that was the designation. If you got your height early, you had a real advantage over your friends. And that was always my escape place. You know, I grew up in a big, tumultuous household with 4 siblings, and mom and dad and the dog and the cat and so on. And I just loved going into the peace and quiet, the stillness of the library, and sitting there as long as I wanted, reading books.
Was it a dream to one day write those books?
You know, I don't know when that became a real dream, but writing was always on my mind. I think when people, you know, it's like a different things people are interested in. Art is perhaps a good example of that. You're always sketching, you're always doodling, and so it was just always there. I don't know that I thought I could ever make a living at it. My intention was to become a high school English teacher because I loved to read and I loved literature and I loved writing, and I obviously excelled in that particular subject. There were some others I was terrible at, but it was a long time, actually. It was nearly into my 30s when I thought, I want to give this a try. I'm not going to really be happy if I don't. And I decided I needed some more education. I come from a family of educators, so it's like education's always the answer, right?
Right.
So back to school for another master's degree, this one in journalism, thinking it would take me into an editorial career. And I got a great job in editorial, and then sat there thinking, but I don't want to be the editor. I want to write. Finally, I just directed myself towards it, and I love nonfiction. I always have. I think I'm a old-fashioned newspaper person at heart, but I love the kind of books I write. So it's been a real happy event to get into them.
I love talking with writers who have studied journalism or have spent time in journalism, because to me it seems like journalists have to see the world a little differently than the rest of us. They're the ones who tell us the things that are happening around the world or show it to us, and in a way that we don't get to see. Do you feel like your time studying journalism has affected and impacted the way that you tell stories?
I do think so. You know, and based on what you just said, my goal, what I love to do, is to tell somebody else's story, to get into their head to such a point so thoroughly that I can do that I can look out at the world through their eyes. And this is what I do in my books for young readers. So there's always a young person in my story that's central to the story, and I want my young readers to literally become that character, and with me to look out through that person's eyes and go through what they went through, you know, to experience it with them, to live it with them, to live it vicariously. And I think that's one of the great joys it has been for me in my writing career. It's not every writer, but some of them are really after the hard news. And, you know, I love the research. I love doing that, but it's getting to know people in that depth that I find very exciting.
Well, there's so many great stories throughout history to be told yet, and so many great characters that stand out and bring resonance to those events. How do you decide which story it is that you're going to tell? And you mentioned that it's always based around a character who has a story to tell in the midst of that. How do you find these stories? Do they come to you? And how do you know that this is the story that's going to be the one that resonates?
Well, there are 9 books now. The book published today, Enemy Child, is number 9, and there's a different story with each of the books, but there are only 2 of them where the story literally found me, the story and the character, pretty much in tandem. The other one had to do with Charles Dickens and his childhood, but this book, I was not looking to write about the Japanese internment camps. Usually that's what for example, when I wrote Under Siege, 3 Children at the Civil War Battle for Vicksburg, I wanted to write about the siege of Vicksburg. And I had to go there, go into the archives, research, and find the stories of people who'd been kids during that experience, and then relate the story through their experiences. With this one, I was in Cody, Wyoming for a completely different reason. I was finishing up my last book, The Boy Who Became Buffalo Bill, and I was at the Buffalo Bill Museum of the West. It's a Smithsonian affiliate in Cody, a fabulous museum. I was in the archives, and I saw an announcement for what was called the Heart Mountain War Relocation Center, located 13 miles from Cody. And I had to think, War Relocation Center, what do those words mean? And I go, oh, that was one of those Japanese-American internment camps. So I knew very little. I'd read a couple of novels. I'd read Snow Falling on Cedars, and had just some sketchy information about it. It wasn't anything that was ever in the textbooks when I was a student or a teacher. And so I went out. I drove out to the camp late that afternoon, and it's actually just the location of the camp. What's there now is this interpretive center and kind of some remnants of some of the former buildings and some things like that. And first of all, the setting was stunning. It's this very wide, dry, arid plain, and at the back of it is this mountain, Heart Mountain. But to envision 500 barracks sitting on that land, surrounded by barbed wire, 10,000 people living there, was mind-boggling. And inside the interpretive center, they had wonderful exhibits showing what life had been like on a daily level for the Japanese Americans incarcerated there. And in that time I spent, I also read about Norman Mineta, and that he had been there as a child, and that he was still active with the Heart Mountain Foundation and came every year for the Heart Mountain pilgrimage. And a reminder, something I needed reminding of, that he was the one who was very instrumental in getting through the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, giving reparations to each person who'd been in the camps who was still alive, and a formal apology from the American government. First time either of those things has ever happened. And it also was talking that day about his friendship with Alan Simpson, the conservative Republican senator from Wyoming, who, as an 11-year-old Boy Scout, had come to Heart Mountain for a day of scouting activities and met up with 11-year-old Norman Mineta, who was a Boy Scout, and they'd spent the day together and had such fun. They didn't see each other or communicate after that until Norm was elected mayor of San Jose, and he got a note from Alan Simpson saying, "Hey, remember me?" And Norm's comment was, "You do not forget Alan Simpson."
Oh,
and
that's
then,
hilarious.
a few years later, they were both in Congress, with Mineta in the House of Representatives and Simpson in the Senate, and they reconnected and became very close friends, and they are to this day. And together they worked on the reparations bill. It was important. Simpson's role was very important in that, for bringing all the Republicans on board.
What a fascinating story. Like you said, you were not that aware of the internment camp situation. It's something that we don't talk a lot about, and that up until just a few years ago, I didn't know that much about either. It's just something that has, as history goes by, we have a way of sweeping things away that are uncomfortable and that we don't want to talk about. What was the situation for people that are not familiar? What were the camps, and what brought this to be?
Well, it really was driven by fear. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, there was great fear in this country that the Japanese would invade the West Coast. And it looked more likely to people because there were 120,000 Japanese Americans living within 50 miles of the Pacific Ocean. At that time, the 1940 census said that there were 150,000 people with Japanese ancestry living in the United States. Okay, 150,000, but 120,000 within that 50-mile corridor of the Pacific Ocean, most of them in California. They had migrated from Japan for the work in agriculture. The early ones came to help build the railroad and the gold rush. Those were the Chinese. The Japanese had mostly come for the agricultural work. So people were afraid of that. And there was a lot of government propaganda to whip up hate against the Japanese because, it was clear before we got into war with them that it was coming. Pearl Harbor was a surprise, but war with Japan was not necessarily a surprise. And, the stereotypes that they would use, same thing Hitler did with the Jews. You make them look like rats. You exaggerate, in this case, their teeth and their eyes, and you color them yellow. And, it's just pure propaganda, right. The way it works. So there was already this anti-Asian bias in this country. We had never allowed Asians, and I'm talking now Chinese, Filipino, Korean, Japanese, to become citizens of the United States. They were forbidden. They couldn't. Their children were citizens by virtue of being born here because the Constitution guarantees that. But a third of that 120,000 people were the first generation, and they were not citizens. And they were outside the protection of the Constitution. As it turned out, it didn't matter because the other two-thirds born here were put into the camps as well, and their constitutional rights were thrown to the wind, So there was a fear of them, and let's face it, there was a lot of racial prejudice because the Japanese had done so well once they got here. They were wonderful farmers. They were producing half of the produce in California as the war started, leasing land or land that was put in their children's names that they could buy. They weren't allowed to own land on their own. Again, these are our first generation who are not citizens. And there were people who wanted that land. There were white farmers who really resented how prosperous the Japanese had become, how good they were. So there was a lot of that going on, too, and that really can't be ignored. That's part of the story as well.
What fascinates me about this story, and when I first saw the book, I knew the name Norman Mineta, and it was it rang a bell, and I couldn't quite place my finger. Like, why do I know this name? And then I realized, he was transportation secretary under President Bush 43. And I said, okay. Now I remember the story. And when you start looking through this and realize what all Mr. Mineta went through, the thing that is really astounding is that this is someone who should, by all rights, have been bitter at his country, he had every right to have a bad attitude, and yet went into a full life of public service. What did you learn about him through this story that really surprised you?
Well, of course, I didn't know Norm before I got in touch with him and proposed writing this book about him, so a lot of things were surprises to me. The gentleness of his character, his kindness. He's a very soft-spoken person. He will never strike you as a politician. He's got a big, welcoming smile. He likes to know about you. He hadn't allowed a book to be written about him before because he didn't feel that he should be singled out. He didn't feel like he had done anything to earn that he was any more important than anyone else. He has lived his life with a very strong moral code. Part of that, I think, is pure Japanese, but there's a piece of that, too, that is simply having had the very remarkable parents he did. He's will very quickly tell you that they were the greatest influence on his life. And when each of them died, his mother died 20 years before his father, and left a terrible hole in Norm's life, as did the later death of his father. They were just such good, decent, loving people. And when all of this business started, the father, Norm's father, said, we love this country. We'll do whatever we can to support it. And if the way that we can support it best is to go into these camps, then we will do this, and we'll make the best of it. Protest. So these people put on their best clothes. They lined up quietly. They filled out all the paperwork. They got all the inoculations. They did everything they were told to do. They cooperated with the FBI when the FBI came in to search their homes. They were models in every way, but they also were feeling tremendous shame over even being suspected to be traitorous to the United States, and they never got over that. This is why there was this conspiracy of silence after the war. They just wanted to forget about it and get on with it. Nobody was going to sit down and talk about it. Nobody was going to say this needs to be part of the educational curriculum. They just wanted it over and done with.
Wow. So when you meet him and strike up this sort of friendship and start hearing his story, how did you decide? Because when you write a book like this, you have to decide what the window of time is going to be that the story takes place. That you give us the details about. How did you decide where the story begins and ends for your book?
Well, the main story, the story I was after was the internment experience. That's what I wanted to be the centerpiece of the book. And then you just figure from there, how much pre-story do we need? So I just, I didn't start with Norm's birth. I started with him 9 years old. He's about to have his 10th birthday. He's a happy kid. He's a Cub Scout. Life is good. And I also felt strongly, and I expected some pushback from my editor. I didn't get any, but I wanted very much to tell the family's backstory, how Norm's father came to this country at age 14, how his mother came as a picture bride later and married his father, and I just felt to know Norm's character and to know the Japanese character, that the struggles that first generation went through who came from Japan was really important. And so I did all the research. Obviously, Norm was very heavily into this with me, telling me the story of the family and what happened to his parents when they came here. And I think that really sets the stage then for how they and all these other Japanese Americans responded when they are put in this impossible situation that they're, being forced from their homes into these very primitive camps. But how they endured there, the community that they built there, whether they were in the desert or in this barren plain. I mean, these camps were built in the most inhospitable places imaginable, swampland in Arkansas, 10 camps, and all of them in very isolated circumstances. One camp in Arizona, even the locals didn't know how to find, is what I have read about that. Some places had alligators, malaria, you name it. I mean, our government took the worst, and this is where these camps were built. And the Japanese did everything possible, humanely possible, to get through that experience with some spirit intact. But it was definitely hard for them, and it took a lot out of them.
Well, the realities of this experience and the story that has to be told around that is stark. The audience for this book is younger readers. And you specialize in writing stories for younger readers, and you have a gift for taking complex situations and making it accessible for younger readers. How do you take a situation like this, tell the truth about it, yet make it where it's not completely traumatizing for a young reader?
Well, this is where, again, going in, behind the eyes of a young person and telling what they see. I mean, I've tackled some tough things. I have a book called Escape from Saigon, How a Vietnam War Orphan Became an American Boy. And this boy was fathered by an American soldier. His mother committed suicide. He was put in a care center in Saigon for a while before he managed to escape Saigon in the final days of the war, he and other children, and to come to this country. I mean, these are not easy topics, but I think kids understand. I mean, you almost can't live in the world today with social media and television and not know that hard things happen. And so what I always stress in this book in Escape from Saigon, in my book Surviving Hitler, A Boy in the Nazi Death Camps, which was probably the toughest challenge in terms of what you were talking about, but my orphan train books too. I mean, all of those kids who got on those orphan trains had already been through great trauma. You know, they were street kids, or they were had lost their parents, or they'd been very abused by their parents and removed from the home. You know, all of these things. But what I'm after always is not only just that history and just that story, but the psychological journey that these characters take, even when they are as young as 10 years old, that they've got decisions to make. Yes, some of them have adults helping them more than others do, but that they are in charge of their attitude and how they're going to see things. And so every book will stress that. You know, these hard things have happened and you feel bitter about it, but you can still have a good life. There's this incredible quote by C.S. Lewis, one of my favorites, that says, you can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending. And I just think that's what comes through in all of these stories. So the kids get real caught up in reading about the main character, and they learn a lot of history. They're just absorbing it. They don't even know they're learning it at the time. But they're also figuring out what's inside of them. And they may have challenges in their lives, small and great, and they're not going to last forever. And they're going to get past them and through them and decide what is going to happen to them from then on. And they know this because they read these nonfiction stories. They live these nonfiction stories, and they see how this works with other children and has worked in history.
We talked earlier about taking a situation, an historical event, putting a personal face on that, and putting an individual story in that. And that's how we can really connect with these events. In this book, Enemy Child, that's out everywhere now, you really bring that home because it's illustrated with tons, I think more than 90 photographs, and many of those were from Mr. Mineta's personal collection, I think. What was it like having access to this? Because every story that you've told, every book that you've written, you don't have that opportunity. Did that make it easier in the writing to really connect with that personal deep story?
Oh, I think so. The visuals in the books, and adults like this too, you know, you almost can't overdo it. The hard part when you're doing a book like I'm doing is finding original copyright holders. You have to get permission, or you can't use the photo. I mean, everything's very informal on the internet, but not in book publishing. And so there are limitations. There were a couple of pictures I really, really wanted to be able to use in the book, but we just couldn't trace back copyright. So they're not included. I felt bad about that. Norm doesn't have an extensive family collection, but there were, as you know, there are some good photos that are in the book. What's not there, what I feel is really missing, is more photos of Norm in the camp. There's only one. And his father had loved photography and had a very nice camera, and the FBI confiscated it. They came through the Japanese-American community and confiscated anything they thought might be useful to the Japanese in an invasion. So a shortwave radio, for example. Certainly a camera would be on that list. Any kind of yard implement or something an agricultural field worker might use. They took all of that, confiscated every bit of it. So without a camera, the family just didn't have personal photos in the camps. There were some cameras in the camps. Some of them were contraband. They were never discovered. But I think they're a little later in the camp story, the administrators weren't being as strict about that if somebody got a camera. The Minetas never did. So that's what's missing. But there are other camp photos, and you just have to fill in with it and say, it would have been like this. So if you see a picture in the book of the kids ice skating at Heart Mountain, because they would flood these plains, and they had plenty of coal to make it ice, and, they'd buy ice skates from the catalogs and skate. You can envision Norm out there doing that because he loved to do it, but we don't have a picture of Norm actually doing it.
Well, the book is Enemy Child. It's available everywhere now. Andrea, what an amazing book you put together. What an incredible story. I would recommend this book for all young readers and for adults too. This is a story that I think we can all connect with.
Thank you so much. And I think Norman Mineta is really worth getting to know. And we'll mention that there will be a documentary about him. This is coincidental with my book, but coming, it'll be on PBS on May 20th. It'll be shown across the country.
Excellent. We'll look for that. Andrea, if people are just learning about you and your work, is there a place where they can find you online to learn more?
Indeed. My website is my name, Andrea Warren, AndreaWarren.com.
Excellent. We're going to send everybody to see you and to pick up a copy of Enemy Child. Andrea, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you so much, Hank. It's been delightful.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
No use crying over spilled milk. Eliza hated that cliche. She'd grown up a cliche, her life a bowl of cherries, duck soup, easy as pie, child's play behind a white picket fence. Mother had been the Wyatt Earp of cliches, firing them off quick draw. A rotten apple spoils the barrel. Smile and the world smiles with you. Every dog has his day. Children should be seen and not heard. She believed them all, particularly this last. Eliza obliged, preferring to wander the streets of Wytheville, Virginia, on her own lonesome terms. The divorce left Laura a spinster librarian, and one false step on icy stairs left her an invalid as well. The accident happened on New Year's Eve, 1950. Laura had just locked the doors of Wytheville Public Library. We must make black-eyed peas tomorrow, Laura had been thinking, with turnip greens. That ensured a lucky new year, and if you swept some money over your threshold, a prosperous one, too. She loved those old Southern traditions. She looked both ways, checking for Negroes, but turned to heel on the icy marble of the stairs and fell into the bushes below, breaking the long bones in both legs. Eliza had taken advantage of her mother's absence. She'd lost her virginity that same night. She'd swept Ron Partridge over her threshold, initiating her own beloved tradition. She was nursing a hangover, giddily reliving the event. But around 8:30 she realized that her mother had not come down to breakfast. She checked her mother's bedroom, found it empty, took the bus down to the library, climbed the high stairs, knocked hard on the library doors, and heard a groan below. Laura lay under the William Penn barberry bushes, below the yellow-trimmed windows of the non-fiction section. Her white stockings ran Jezebel red with blood. Sweat and melted snow had soaked her blouse, and her gray forehead blazed. The broken bones didn't kill Laura Merrick. She lay in the hospital, wheezing, her legs mortared up in casts. She had few visitors after the first week. Her church group was glad to fret over a poor thing for a day or two, but they trickled away when Laura had the bad manners to linger. On Valentine's Day, as her mother slept, Eliza drew big, sloppy hearts on her casts. Laura harumphed when she woke and insisted on keeping her legs hidden beneath blankets afterwards. But in late March, something miraculous happened. Laura's self-control dropped. She ranted at nurses, spit at doctors, swore like a Navy pilot dropping F-bombs on Hiroshima. She had dementia, the doctors said. Eliza decided that her mother had just stopped believing her own bullshit. The spells continued over the next 2 weeks, and Eliza enjoyed her mother's company for the first time. They swapped bawdy jokes, ogled the handsome interns, and chattered like best girlfriends late into the evening. They had long conversations, and Laura spoke her own mind in her own words about things that mattered to her. It broke Eliza's heart when the prim, condescending librarian returned. Laura hardly acknowledged anything that had passed between them. The cliches returned. You can't have your cake and eat it too. A leopard doesn't change its spots. Nothing is certain except death and taxes. This last proved true. On April 15th, Laura Merrick marked her Bible with a tongue depressor, set it on her nightstand, leaned back against the headboard, and coughed blood down the front of her nightdress. Eliza found her that way, dead as the proverbial doornail, and yes, the blood was thicker than water, just as her mother had always said. Much thicker than water, in fact. Perhaps as thick as molasses in January.